This episode, I'm joined by R. Michael Fisher, who is the director of the In Search of Fearlessness Research Institute. In this episode, we discuss Fearism, alongside discussions on society, belief, healing, and therapy. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support Mythics or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, R. Michael Fisher, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing the philosophy, the theory of fearism, as in when people have fear, as in F-E-A-R, so fearism. You are the author of Philosophy of Fearism, a first East-West dialogue alongside Desh Suba, alongside some other works, Fear, Law and Criminology, Fearless Engagement of Four Arrows, and one other work. But thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're most welcome. Good to be here, James.
Before we jump in with what Fearism specifically is, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do.
Well, in the moment, I guess you could kind of call me a very eclectic Renaissance type person, number one. And, I live and work out of my home. So I'm an entrepreneur in that sense and have been since about 1983. Been through many career tracks, everything from ecology and activism, environmentalism, biology, wildlife biology, and I was also a wildlife painter. I've been an educator. Then I got into rehabilitation work and working with adolescent youth and problems with families that they have. Kind of gone around and dipped into philosophy, psychology, obviously along that road, did a lot of healing work and still do, because I believe trauma is really one of the most important things affecting the planet right now. So kind of a long route of many career tracks, but ultimately I'm an independent intellectual, I'm a scholar in my own way, and I've picked a topic a long time ago that I was pretty much felt called to, and that was the study of the nature of fear and fearlessness. And I put those together because I don't talk about one without talking about the other. I think they have to go together. And then Fearism, is kind of a latest iteration of focus, although back to early as 1990, I did mention the word Fearism in some of my unpublished works. So we can talk about the history of Fearism in a moment. I think to know more about me, I really am a kind of artist, type person. And that's important to note because artists never like to be put in a box. And they always like to think in multiple ways and perspectives of how can I look at an angle, a perspective, put different lens right on the ordinary. And putting that is really important when it comes to the study of fear, fearlessness, fearism, whatever. I'm always working to not just fall down the ordinary path. And I will just say the last other thing is I'm an ecological thinker. I'm a naturalist. I was born and raised in a family where my dad was a fisherman, recreation fisherman. And as soon as we could walk, he took us fishing, virtually every weekend, showed us the art and the subtleties of how to catch trout in a stream. And I've been thinking about that and how profound it is in almost everything I still do to this day in the way I think, because it's really about the hunter and the prey and your respect that you have to have for not only the environment in which your prey exists, but the actual approach to hunting, or in this case, fishing. And I began to think that is so foundational to everything because fear, no matter how you're going to frame it and all the complexities, all the different perspectives, fundamentally, I keep coming back to it is so much a part of the hunting, gathering, culture, and particularly when I talk about hunting. And being a male myself by identity, it's almost impossible not to think and imagine my world as being anything. In some ways, obviously it's more complex, but it still fundamentally is about predator-prey relationships.
Mm-hmm. I'm just gonna, before we jump in with the Hermitix question, I mean, there's a lot to take from that, what you just said there. But there's one big question for me is something you said early on, which is why do you how do you define trauma, and why do you believe it's like one of the biggest problems in the world today?
There's a lot of longer theorizing and thinking around behind that, but coming out of a biographical experience myself, I was born to a mother who comes from Belgium, and so I'm a first generation Canadian on my mother's side. So she was an immigrant, she was a war bride. And I started studying the history of her background because she was a very difficult woman to live with, period, including a lot of mental health problems that got very difficult at the end. Well, why? Because she has a history and she has a biography, and she comes out of a Nazi invasion of Belgium for probably, near 3 years. She was a young teenager when the Nazis took on the streets. They're standing on the corners with rifles. And when we ever tried to ask her about, the war that time, her typical reaction was, I don't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So when you hear that as a little boy, little kid, and you're trying to understand who you are, right? You're forming your identity. It's really important to do this healing work on cross-generational trauma. So what do I mean by cross-generational trauma? A lot of people are defining trauma in different ways, but just simply, it's when people are hurt systematically and are not able to heal the woundedness, either soon enough, to actually not have really damaging effects, or they don't heal it, period, ever. And so that whole process of trauma for me is, we are not generally, this is the philosophical point, we're not raised in a healing culture in the modern world. And I'm talking about the West. That's where I'm from, European, North American, call it what you will. And I'm not going to talk about North and South differences because, again, I don't know much about the far South. But in my Northern Western kind of exposure and living, I would say we're not a healing culture. We don't teach kids, when you're hurt, this is how you heal. And that's what trauma-informed research now, trauma-informed education is going into more and more parts of our society, basically saying you have to learn to recognize when you're actually traumatized, when you're hurt, and that there's an actual natural healing process. So that's going to all become relevant, James, when we start talking about fear and fearlessness. Mm-hmm. But there's a little bit of an intro on my view of trauma.
Okay. So yeah, before we do jump into fear and fearlessness and fearism, I do have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Yeah, so I think I would put Donald Trump. I would put Ken Wilber, an integral philosopher, and I would probably put Bracha Ettinger, who's a psychoanalyst, Israeli psychoanalyst, artist, and a theorist.
So, of course, I'm going to ask, why Trump?
Because I think it's really important to be in the room with your nemesis. And the nemesis being, quote, the enemy, quote. And I put quote marks on there because I'm fascinated by how enemy making, right? And the way fear can project through, our shadows that we don't want to face. We will love to project those onto others. And I'm not saying they don't deserve some of the projections. I'm just saying that they become iconic, as Trump has become in North America. You can't live in Canada and not be aware of the impact he's having. And so I'm really interested, like Carl Jung would say, right? Face the shadow. As Sam Keen said, face the shadow, face the enemy and your enemy making processes, and be very aware, conscious of how you're forming those enemies. And because why would I want to be cautious is because you got a lot to learn from them. So that's why I'd want them in the room.
Okay. I don't know the second two all that well at all. So is there a specific conversation that you think would arise there, or is this sort of a clear episode where a lot of aspects of Fearism would come to the
I think they would, and but primarily when you look at sort of the iconic labeling of Trump from a lot of camps, not all, obviously, he is the master of fear. Mm-hmm. And you can call it fear mongering, you can call it a toxic fearism, that he participates in that field dynamics, that psychosocial dynamic of basically how can fear be used, to my advantage. And then we can now start to go into a deeper analysis and say, well, and again, psychoanalysis would do this quite naturally. I call it fear analysis, is that you start to see, well, where did this person, this being, this pattern that's controlling this person's personality, where did it come from? Right? Just like with my mother, I had to understand that she was a product of, Nazi invasion Germany, Belgium. And what implications does that have when she has not healed that or done the interior work of that? Donald Trump, same, has not done probably the interior work that he would need to do of the kind of way he was brought up. And what we've learned, there's lots of biographies being done and analysis that he lived in a very fearful home where his father was quite brutal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's one of it's come up a couple of times on this podcast now. In regard to Trump, about how when he was young, he went to the lectures of Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. This supposedly is one of the places where Trump's ability to sort of make anything seem amazing comes from.
Right.
So,
right.
I've joked on here before about how there could be 30,000 corona deaths, but he would say it and he'd make it come across in such a way that it would come across as this good thing, right? We're like, we've had 30,000 deaths this year, right? I don't want to make a joke out of that, but that is, if you listen to Trump, that is sort of how he operates, is he has this ability to make anything, however bleak, or seem great. And do you think that is almost like a common technique to mask fear? Is this like a illusory way of changing it so it becomes a different emotion?
Illusory and magical, really seriously. I mean, I think it's a way to cope. And when I talked about, if you're not in a healing culture, you're in a coping culture. I kind of make that distinction. And then you're in all your defense mechanisms, that are used for coping with the woundedness, your own terror, your own fear. And to make a joke out of everything, we see this in all kinds of people who are, very wounded people. The tough bravado is not unfamiliar in many cultures, especially patriarchal type cultures, where males have to be the great, powerful heroes generally. And that pushes males to be conditioned and to play out and dramatize those kinds of, I'm basically, cannot be touched by anything. I cannot be injured. And so you get a lot of peak performance people onto this trip. He's a kind of peak performance actor, and he's very good at peak performance acting and positivism, if we want to call it in that way. I'm not talking about in the empirical positivism, but in the sense of turning everything into positive. I have read Norman Vincent Peale, and I've just written a book with a chapter on Trump, actually, and it's about Marianne Williamson and her bid for the presidency. And I was fascinated how she was this polar opposite with Trump, and yet both of them are quite positivist thinkers, highly optimistic, although Trump is way over the top in that regard. Mm-hmm. So you just don't show your weaknesses, right? And of course, you don't want to do that when you're under the regime of constantly being battered by, authoritarian parent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. To jump into Fearism, I'm not just going to sort of flat out ask you to define it. So I think everyone, to a certain extent, we could probably all agree on a common definition of fear. It's something that you're scared of or attempt to avoid or as you say, something that you are going to develop ways to cope with. But is there a different definition of fear in relation to fearism?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to circle on that a little bit and come back to it. So if I get off track, pull me back. Mm-hmm. I appreciate the question of definition, right? Because as a philosopher type myself as well, I'm going to use the analogy I was thinking of. It's been going around for years, the story of if you talk to someone an Eskimo or an Inuit or a Dene person, an indigenous person who lives in the north, I'm talking about way north where there's snow most of the year. And a Westerner comes from the south and asks them, so, what's your definition of snow? Mm-hmm. And an indigenous person will, the story goes is they look at you and they go, well, we have 23 definitions of snow. Which one do you want to know? And I'm kind of use that same analogy, and this is related to fearism. Why did fearism appear? As a way of understanding fear. And of course, a way of understanding the world, reality. Is that I think we've gone down a very narrow track, a convenient track, not all bad, not all wrong, but very partial in our understanding of fear. Just as we have, and it would be easy to go down the track of trying to understand snow and having a definition for snow. And we might have 2 or 3 different nuances of different kinds of snow. Well, in fear, it's very interesting. Once you start to listen to the Western world, it's got, 450 phobias that are named, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're putting fear into all these different containers. And so fearism and the philosophy of my own thinking, even before I came to the notion of fearism and met Desh Suba, I was interested in fear itself before it gets casted down into all the phobias, all the fears of spiders, fear of this, fear of that, fear of 13. And I thought those would not be all that useful to actually understand the process or the mechanism and the philosophy that fear itself is bringing to the world. So I was interested in a much expanded notion of fear right from the start. So I had a couple strategies I want to share in how I started that. Again, in respect that it's basically fear is just an abstract term, and then we can define it, and that may be very convenient, and then we think we've located fear right where it's supposed to be. It's the mechanism is the amygdala in the brain, and the fear is my fear of height, right? Or we have these natural fears and so on, or loud sounds. And all of a sudden I'm like this curious, hermeneutics of suspicion guy, in Ricoeur's sense of the philosopher Ricoeur, that I always am doubting. I start with the doubt that I don't want to be following any convenient, conventional, easy way down to be able to locate fear. So then we can say, wow, we have a common understanding of fear now. It's in the dictionary. It's in our medical encyclopedias. As soon as I see all that, I go, okay, partially true. Partial truth there, no doubt. But can we deconstruct that? Can we start to take that apart? And I even go as far as to put the question, which fearism does as a philosophy, how do we know that our understanding of fear, our definition, our convenient definition, is not itself fear-based? So that's an epistemological question, right? Mm-hmm. And we could ask that about anything, right? How do you know the truth, right? Your confidence in the truth. How do you know that that's actually not fear-motivated truth? In other words, it's a truth you've used for convenience that makes you feel less anxious, that makes you feel more protected and safe because you've got that definition fixed. And then you can be very confident about it, right? And you could even be ideological about it. And you can want to change the world and try to convert the world to your definition. So that's where I sort of start the epistemological inquiry. And the books that I've written on fear, pretty much are my articles, always have that doubt, that questioning, that deconstruction. So just to share with you, James, and the audience, that a lot of my writing, I actually put the words, and they can do this in writing. It's harder to do when we're talking. I put little apostrophes, right? A single apostrophe on the word fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear with the click marks, right? As you sometimes call it, scare marks. And that immediately is to raise the awareness to the reader. And I define this for people. I do that because I want to raise the awareness. Let's not let ourselves get into a convenient discussion about fear that falls down a very comfortable definition and meaning. I want it always to be in question. So that's what those marks mean. And again, in verbal conversation, that would be complex. I would have to go fear with clicks, right? I can do that, but it's not a comfortable discourse to have that all the time. So why I'm saying this all is, as you and I are going to be going into talking about fear, we have to both, and this is my challenge as a fearologist, in a sense, as someone who practices this philosophy of fearism, I have to continually talk at multiple levels. I talk at the level of, okay, this person I'm talking with right now wants to talk about fear as if we know exactly what it is, as if it's already defined in the dictionary, in the traditions of psychology or philosophy, whatever. And I go, okay, well, I do have to have the conversation. I have to use that language because the word is there. But all the time, I am also saying I want to leave space for the fear with the click marks, because I put everything that we're saying about fear in a different conversation that's based on an inquiry, a critical inquiry, a critical philosophical analysis, a fear analysis of fear itself, a fear analysis of our language of fear that we use, the way we construct sentences that has fear in it, or a story or a film or an image. All of these can be analyzed in how are we representing, right? This is the problem of representation, basis to all philosophy and perception. How do we represent reality? How do we represent this reality of fear? So all of a sudden, fearism discussion, when I entered the ism, Desh and I came to this uniquely on our own, and we basically independently, you know what I mean? And we basically said by adding the ISM onto the word fear, it actually does the same effect as putting the click marks, the apostrophes on, the scare marks, right? It all of a sudden puts fear in a different context. Well, that's what artists love to do, right? You'll take an apple and it looks like an apple, and then you put it in a certain kind of landscape or painting, and you've changed the meaning of the apple. That's what we're doing by putting ism on the word fear. We want to raise the awareness and consciousness. Fear is not exactly what you may think it is. Well, you know what I've learned? That scares the shit out of people. Isn't it? It's so much of an interesting irony and paradox. We're actually trying to develop a philosophy of fearism to enlighten our understanding of fear in a more expansive way than generally we've been taught, and falling into these conventional ways of knowing fear. But at the same time, it's incredibly scary. And I know it myself. I've gone through this myself, and I've gone through it having many conversations. People don't want to talk about something so complex that might disrupt the very comfortable definition of fear itself. So that leads to the problem of what I call transdisciplinary study, right? We could call it interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary is what I prefer. So fearism is based on a transdisciplinary approach to understanding the nature and role of fear and life.
It's interesting what you say about fearism, because I think it's key. It would be awkward to do the click sounds every time. So fearism does work as that. Okay, yeah. We're now having this more of an epistemological, genuine investigation into fear. As I was going to say earlier, that actually it did actually almost sound like a transcendental argument between almost phenomena and noumena, in that let's say the phenomenal or the represented fears, representation I'm speaking of here, whether it's of the representation of height or of a spider, or as you say, of the number 13, they are working on a phenomenal level, but there is this force, this knowledge, this something other, which is fear itself, which is sort of being projected onto these representations. So I think it's interesting to begin to draw fear into that framework of fear as a representation, and then fearism, which is the investigation of what's actually sort of happening at a functional level there. But I think, sorry.
I would just add one third bit to that. I think you're right on. Thank you. That's good. Fearism directs us to analyze the knowledge of fear itself. Mm-hmm. And that directs us to how we are educated about fear itself. Mm-hmm. That's just what I would add. Okay.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is I think to begin towards sort of understanding fearism, I think what I'd like to do is bring in I've been reading, I just finished reading Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. I don't know if you've...
Oh, yes, indeed.
Yeah. So, and I think this is probably one of the it's coincidental in a good way that I've read this so recently, but it's one of these books where basically Becker is stating that the reason that we construct, invent, create all of the societal and structural structures around us is a way to avoid the imminent and definite mandatory death that we all have. So it's a way of avoiding our mortality. So this is one of the big arguments that many people, I think, would put forward. Freud included, though it did change a little near the end, but obviously Becker and many others would state that many, many fears are sort of a secondary fear, which is related to the fact that you are mortal and that you could die. And I mean, you could relate this to many of the ones that we actually stated. So like the fear of heights is in a very clear way related to the fact that you're having this like bodily sensation that if I go any further, I'm going to fall and I'm a mortal being. The unlucky number 13, I'm going to have bad luck and, my finite life is going to get worse. In what sense does fearism have a relationship to death? And in what sense does it veer away from these traditional arguments?
Yeah, so let's keep with the death drive.
Okay.
So that we move off of the noun of death, right, and move it into a process, and move it into a motivational language. So I always want to move to motivations, or what we can call in this case with Becker. He was really articulating, I think it's fair to say, a meta drive, a meta motivational drive. In other words, it's a drive that contains and in a way is a matrix for all the other drives that follow from it, right? So he was going after the death drive. And then, of course, Freud, picked that up and he said there was a death drive. So this is before Becker. And, others have had a sense of a death drive going back even further into philosophy and others. But they also have a life drive. Mm-hmm. And that was the classic sort of binary that Freud, as a contemporary, picked up on. Well, yes, fearism is interested in that discourse. So notice I just said something, I used this word discourse. Fearism is interested in how we talk about something as deep as a metamotivational drive, a drive that's sort of the mother of all drives. And that's where I think Becker, he was partially accurate, I would say. And you need to also be very critical of, and I am critical of, in trying to make death drive the drive of survival. And that's where ultimately we get so much discussion and discourses, especially in the West, especially sort of Spencerian, Darwinian kind of thinking and imaginary of life and humans, right? This human condition is that we know, or even I think Heidegger said it, right? We are beings toward death. Mm-hmm. So I'm just saying, okay, that's all really worth studying and understanding. But I always want to back that up and say, well, then what do we do with the life drive? Well, and then some people would argue, well, the life drive is just a drive to avoid death. So you kind of get into a reductionistic loop. And I'm not saying that's inaccurate. I'm saying it probably has a lot of truth to it. That's why those descriptions, right, representations of our motivation are being articulated in such a way because they have some resonance. They have a pull. But at the same time, here's where I think Becker is even more important than his death drive thesis. His thesis is that culture, so now we're moving beyond individuals, is that cultures play the role of maintaining themselves, itself. It's really an it perspective now when you're at culture. They're designed in a way. Culture actually evolved to actually help humans, organisms, other species, apparently some have, parts of culture too. But it evolved as a way to contain the anxiety, the suffering, the hurt, the pain of life. And pain can scare us. It can scare any organism. Its pain is something that could move you toward demise, more or less. An injury could put you in more of a vulnerable position toward facing a predator or a competitor in a power hierarchy. So the reality is getting hurt and puts you in a vulnerable position. I think that is a really kind of foundational truth that I think I sort of stick with. Becker would too. But Becker says we have to look at culture. So in other words, you can't look at the death drive as a psychological individual experience alone. And that's what a lot of people miss. And they kind of go to the individualistic perspective of the individual psyche, right? My fear of death. The culture, he said, is actually a defense mechanism against, and I would say not just death, it's a defense mechanism against injury, trauma. Trauma, now I qualify this, it's a defense mechanism against trauma that cannot be healed fast enough. In other words, accumulated trauma. And that is where cultures, you can have a really healthy culture that helps us heal. It has rituals for healing. It knows exactly, how to help, give us a container for the anxiety, put it into rituals, sing songs, do dances, share the stories, of tragedy and so on. And all of that is the attention that we need for the healing process, for self-regulation, as we call it in physiotherapy terms or physiological terms. We need to self-regulate our systems to bring them back to homeostasis. That's the drive. That's a healing drive. That's a self-regulation drive. And I'm going to suggest, from a Fearism perspective, that is much more the drive that sustains life and keeps us, in a healthy condition is the self-regulation drive. In other words, when you're distressed, de-stress. When you're hurt, heal. That's an imperative. Any organism that does not do that was going to go into a chronic condition of toxification, trauma, as we label it. Then that's real trauma. So death drive is it's a subset, of this more profound drive, which is the profound drive to self-regulate. And you could say, and again, you could argue, well, the reason that we have the drive to self-regulate is because we're afraid to die, right? So you can always bring it back to the fear of death. I'm just suggesting that would be a really disturbing and I think a distortive reductionism. Going back to the same, and now I'll put another layer on that. The reason I think that's not only a dangerous quote, it's just impartial, it's a partial, and it's probably distortive, is because it ignores the reality of the importance of the life drive for the purpose of life itself. In other words, everything is not an avoidance of. I would say, a lot of things we do is an avoidance of something. We also have something called desire. And that is in nature, arguably. And that's why I think it's separate from a need. A desire is the exuberance of life itself in its own self-transcending evolutionary drive to expand, you can use consciousness theories to expand consciousness, to experience beauty, truth, goodness. All of those are major meta drives as well. So I break sort of a little quick theory, and then I'll let you jump in. I say that the foundational meta motivation is an ecology of fear. In other words, all the dynamics that fear involves, predator-prey relationships, survival, all of those, that's foundational to our meta motivation. Absolutely. Then I say above that, as you satisfy more and more of those, quote, needs or, conditions, the next meta drive that's sitting there, it's just ready to unfold. It's instinctually genetic. It's historical of all living creatures, is you have to reproduce. Once you survive, right, then you have to reproduce. Well, I call that the ecology of love. So ecology of fear is the foundational. Above that, it's secondary, but it's a higher order. It's a higher, more significant level of existence, of being. But I just put the big category, call it love. And that's the uniting. That's the uniting to then transcend and integrate the other, the opposite, and all these things. And then the higher one, even higher beyond that in this quick little meta motivational theory, is the drive or the meta motivation for freedom. So fear, love, freedom. And I call that whole trajectory, those three layers, I call that the path of fearlessness. Okay, over to you.
You mentioned desire. Now,
yeah.
You also mentioned that it's this sort of natural thing that arises just from the sort of the vitality of life, correct?
You could call it a vitality, impulse.
So what happens when something sort of hijacks the collective desire of a society, such as consumer culture?
Yeah, so anytime that those natural desire, right, that pursuit of, freedom and love and those higher forms, every time you get that hijack, right, is basically an injury. It's an injury to the organism, to the system. And it's an attempt to then regress, to not kind of, in a sense, keep on that transcendental trajectory, if you will. And it's an attempt to regress, to try and collect, to be safe, secure, power, that's going to secure me and not the other. So path of fearlessness is definitely a path that would take us beyond that fear-based structuring, which I just described. But a lot of people and culture itself can get caught into patterns, these pathologies, which all development has pathologies. And then it circulates around, keep going back to the survival death drive, use it against others to get advantage. And one could go into even a very long metaphysical explanation of that, as Ken Wilber does in his work, of why is it that we have to dominate? I think that's kind of a question that, do we have to dominate as a species? Do all species do that? And I basically say, yeah, domination exists. It probably always will. From domination comes conflict. Conflict does exist. It always will. How well you manage conflict when there's a domination subordination experience going on, how well you manage conflict, how well you understand conflict is going to then produce results that are really important. Because if you don't do the conflict well with those who are dominating you, if the system doesn't handle that well, then you're going to move into fear. And the more you move into fear, the more you're going to move into violence. Mm-hmm. And then you got a cycle of violence, a cycle of fear violence that continues to produce what I'd call an unhealthy domination. In other words, I have an argument that you could actually say domination exists because if I stepped on your foot because I want to stand where you're standing, that's a form of domination. I want to be there. Mm-hmm. And you're going, no, I'm standing here. Well, animals do that. Plants do that. They compete with each other for space. It doesn't have to be toxic, and it doesn't have to be systematically oppressive. However, through time, and especially through culture conditioning, cultures have this, as Becker argues, cultures are designed on basically the human fears, the hurt, the injury, the traumas. And those cultures are trying to protect those individuals, that society, to like a meme, right? There's like a gene. It wants to survive and not have the others survive. So you kind of get into gene theory and social biological evolutionary psychology, and those kind of the genetic need to survive. And that's a competition, because I'm taking space up. You could be in the space I'm in. So there's a competition.
Mm-hmm. I think one of a productive question to put in now that I think many people might be asking is, how then do you recognize trauma which has come from fear? So I guess the big question there would be, how do you actually recognize fear? Especially at that societal level, that's a really tough question.
Yeah,
I mean, everyone knows that when they're scared of, when they've got vertigo or when they're scared of spiders.
Yeah.
But when you are subconsciously constructing something as a coping mechanism, how can you begin to recognize that?
That's a really important shift, right? Because, a lot of fear management that you can just read tons of fear management books or as articles as I have for 30 years. They pretty much assume that you already know what the fear is that you're going to manage. Well, that's a big assumption. You might be working on that fear, but that fear arguably is a symptom. It is not the root cause of the fear patterning that you're experiencing, and the fear patterning being based in a traumatic patterning. That's kind of the connection I make. And the argument then is culture even puts that into a normalization process. So a culture will take and normalize. We have now this term culture of fear. We live in a culture of fear, right? All kinds of disciplines have been using this term. And I've been fascinated by that. When fear moved to the cultural level, it's actually a culture of fear. And then you go, well, that's the water I swim in. How would I even know that I'm in fear? Right? Mm-hmm. In a certain level. That's where fear becomes part of the language structure, the discourse structure, the structural part of social life. And we are social beings. So that's where we get hooked. And we have to somehow figure out, and there's lots of ways to do that. Carl Jung said as well, you have to individuate and go through a process of individuation from your social cultural conditioning. A lot of people have said that. And that's the whole pursuit of philosophy, is to become an individuated individual thinker. Not that you're dissing or trying to erase the social cultural conditioning, but you don't want to be stuck in the development of just being a social being. And that's what I think the whole philosophical pursuit has been. I think it's the pursuit of all spiritual traditions, certainly the mystical side of spiritual traditions that move beyond that social cultural conditioning, which arguably, as Becker says, he actually says it's fear-based. Culture is fear-based. So recognize it. He's not saying it's bad. It evolved. It's there for a reason. It's serving purposes. But if you don't recognize it, then it starts to put you basically into a kind of cultural trance. And it's using your fear to feed its fear to maintain itself and to be dominant. And that's why cultures destroy each other, right? They want to destroy each other because they can't believe there's another culture that has a different worldview than mine. How's that possible? Our values are right. We'll prove it. We'll kill you. Terror management theory.
Do you think that even if one wasn't to actually eradicate a certain fear or all their fear, even that sort of personal addressing of the fact that they have fear is is enough of a sort of a springboard to begin towards a more authentic way of being?
Yeah, absolutely. Nicely said. So I say, do your fear work. Just like I would say to people, do your conflict work. You have to figure out how to do conflict well. Just like I'd say, if you want to be an artist, do your artwork. If you want to be a liberationist, do your liberation work. So I use this idea of fear work with Fearism. Philosophy of Fearism is, I've used this definition, fear work, and I've used the concept of fearuality. And I think this is relevant to what you just asked. Fearuality is a term I created from studying sexuality, from studying spirituality. because I went, why do they have this larger term? Because sex is not just sex. Fear is not just fear. Sex is part of fear, sexuality, right? So again, that's a way to enlarge the term so we don't get stuck on sex, and we start to educate ourselves. How do we develop sexually? I say, how do we develop fearually? And once you start changing the language around that, then we don't get caught into, I have this fear and I have to figure out how to conquer it or beat it or, I'm actually doing this fear work, if I start with one fear I have, I'm starting fear work because I want to develop my fearuality. What a different way to think about it. Can you get that feel for that? Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's really part of the education. The term I use is we need a new fear management education on this planet, big time. The reason is our trauma, our cultural trauma, our individual trauma is so accumulating so quickly and has for arguably, some people say thousands of years, where we've moved away from healing cultures to coping cultures. And that trauma is accumulating so quickly, it is not surprising to me we now call ourselves, at least certain critical theorists do, we're living in a culture of fear. Well, what does that mean? We're living in a culture of trauma. And it's not being healed fast enough. And so the fear work, it's not been done fast enough. The conflict work has not been done fast enough, right? We've delayed it culturally, socially conditioned. Our school systems don't help us a lot. And so we've delayed the work that we need to do, and now we're paying the price. We're paying the price of being on the brink of extinction.
Mm-hmm. So one big question for me, just because I have a sort of a big interest in horror, is that a lot of people would put fear within the same categories as terror, horror, and even cosmic horror, which I think all have different definitions. Would you put it in with those, or do you think that the experience of horror is actually far different to the experience of fear?
Why don't you just tell me how you understand horror and terror?
Well, terror I would define along the lines of terrorism, which is that there is some sort of force which is actually terrorizing, which is for a certain aim. So it's usually just to cause a certain chaos within a certain area or within a certain collective. That's sort of the.
So you're giving a more collective definition than an individually.
But when it moves, when you move to, well, I think terror could affect you individually as well. I think
absolutely.
There could be something out there that you individually believe is there just to simply cause chaos in your life. As for horror, I think that is. The difference between horror and cosmic horror is a bit different. Like, I think it's so niche that I won't even go into it. So I just subsume them together and say that horror is the emotion of complete and utter insignificance as a human being.
Okay.
Yeah. That's how I would define it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And of course, then the question becomes, just to parse that out a little bit, is what is the development of the self in that confrontation with cosmos? In other words, because we know that there's a lot of good evidence and a lot of different theorizing and evidence that the self actually goes through multiple stages of development. And this is known in the Far East, it's known in the West, in developmental psychology and so on. So we're always having to deal with, in understanding the effect of, let's just call it cosmic horror, that it may be also a symptom of, a condition of, the particular development level of the self. In other words, the self-identity, the self-awareness. Because with an expanding sense of self, as the argument is in a spectrum of selves, that developmentally you can reach levels where you would not experience that cosmic horror at, let's say, level 7 compared to at level 2. Because the self is in a very different structure. It's not so threatened, arguably, and that's what the path of fearlessness is I argue the theory of fearlessness as based on different fear management systems or self systems. And those self systems all have a different kind of conscious level of awareness. And I'm not putting one as better than the other in any absolute way, but relatively they are distinct. And this can be argued. So without that theory, a developmental theory, or what you might call it, even a vertical theory, then I would agree with you. What you just stated actually totally makes sense. But when you start nuancing that within a developmental evolutionary theory of consciousness, then that becomes problematic. In other words, you can't put horror down, or even terror, or even fear at the same way. You'll understand it differently at different levels. And you have a different meaning relationship to fear, terror, horror. But I think it is an interesting distinction. I have not thought a lot, so I'm admitting I have not thought a lot of the difference between terror or horror.
Okay.
I also want to just say that, as you said, terrorism and the collective understanding of terror, that is another reason, and that's so back to the history of Fearism. Fearism did not start as a philosophy of Fearism. Fearism started in my writing. As far as I know, nobody was using it back in the 90s when I was, the early 90s, although I found one reference. We were using Fearism, myself and this other person that I found in an article in a magazine. We were using it as the same analogy to terrorism. And what we were saying is that terrorism is just the extreme expression, the bomb going off, of what was building up before the bomb went off. What was building up before the bomb went off was Fearism. So we both, and myself and I, still use it. I sometimes call it now toxic Fearism to distinguish it from Destuba's notion of Fearism, because he does not develop that toxic form of Fearism in the same way.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
Makes sense. One thing that's sort of that came up in my research is, in what way does Fearism sort of differ? Because it seems to be a very practical philosophy. You speak about realizing your fear, healing yourself, recognizing your trauma. On a very individual level. It almost seems like it could be a form of therapy. Perhaps I'm off the mark, and it actually is a form of therapy.
Yes, Suba definitely calls it a form of therapy.
Okay. In what sense does it differ? I mean, I'm sure there's many ways, but in what sort of primary senses does it differ from cognitive behavioral therapy, which one of the sort of tenets of is to eventually face your fears?
So, modern cognitive behavioral therapy also now is being mixed in with a hybrid of neuropsychology. As you know, brain has become the new thing to define reality. And so they get mixed together because cognitivism gets really mixed in with brain function and the new neurosciences. So it's basically a reductionist approach, is what I'll say. From a Fearism perspective, it's a reductionist lens on both understanding fear and on how to, quote, manage, heal, transform, change fear into, quote, a more positive direction. So Fearism, because I said it was transdisciplinary, it's also sort of immediately has to be holistic. It has to be an integral approach, Fearism. And that's what you'll not get from cognitive behavioral therapy. So let me give the practical way. If I walk into an office of a cognitive behavioral therapist, and I've met many, I've studied it, the technique, I've even used it in my own therapy practice. But what happens is, what cognitive behavioral therapy does is it says, okay, we are here, we're cognitive behavioral therapists, and we're going to study fear, or we're going to work on fear. So it's always taking the lens of the method, cognitive behavioral therapy, and all the assumptions behind that. It takes that lens and then it drops it onto the topic fear. Because you could drop it onto the topic of, sexuality. You could drop cognitive behavioral therapy onto the topic of mental health problems. So what's happening there, from my point of view, and Dashubud would agree, it's a over-dominating, over-determined methodology that is trying to then take fear and work fear within its paradigm. Got me? Like it's basically a biomedical paradigm. And that or psychological, paradigm, part of the biomedical model. And I go, whoa, that, okay, has some partial value, has some partial truth, but be very cautious. That is another type of reductionism that I think would be very dangerous and not help us in the long run to understand fear, capital F fear, or the capital F, capital P fear problem that humanity has to face. That's not going to be solved by cognitive behavioral therapy. That for me is absolutely reason. I know that you're going to treat symptoms and you're going to treat it through the cognitive behavioral lens. So what Fearism does, it would say, well, why don't you take cognitive behavioral therapy and drop that methodology and drop it in a good way, drop it into the Fearism lens, the lens of Fearism. And then use your cognitive behavioral therapy. That's fine. Keep it. But drop it through the Fearism lens, the philosophy of Fearism. So if I had my ideal, I would train all cognitive behavioral therapists to study the philosophy of Fearism first, before you start treating fear.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about Fearism that you feel is critical that we haven't looked at?
Yes, there is. There is no one definition of Fearism. There is no one set of agreed upon principles from thinkers who use the concept of Fearism. There are some contradictory ideas and definitions and constructions of Fearism that exist today. It's relatively new. It's a very new formation of a way of conceptualizing and representing the study or fear work. As I said, it's a very new, and so it's going to have all the problems of a naive, a nascent, form of knowing or thought or philosophy, whatever. Just like all things that start, they go through a big mess for a long time before eventually, maybe in 10, 20 years, if we last that long as a species, I think that Fearism will eventually start to coalesce, if not sooner, and there will be some really good, strong principles. There will be research that's actually done to validate some of those principles and hypotheses, and that's not been done yet. So I share this all with you as an invitation to all listeners to bring what you want to bring to the area of Fearism and this notion, and let's see together what we can create.
Okay. Where would you advise the audience to begin with Fearism?
Well, certainly start to do some reading. And if you look on the internet, there is a lot to find. You'll find Desh Suba he's a Nepali philosopher, literature writer in literary poetry and so on. And he is 2014, he really wrote this major book. My work, I go back to the late 1980s, and I've used the word Fearism. You'll find lots of my publications on that. So we'll both come a little bit different, both of us, but we are the main writers, and now there are some students that are starting to use it. And then you have to be cautious because there are a lot of people using Fearism, not a lot, but a significant number you'll find on the internet, who use the term Fearism in a very loose, right, as kind of popular slang. It has no particular rigor or consistency or systematization to its understanding. It's basically used as a substitute for fear mongering.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to finish up. Michael, thanks very much.
Okay, James. Glad to have this conversation.